what you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. I'm your host Mike and thank you so much for joining me for our latest episode. In tonight's show we've got a returning guest backed by popular demand. His name is Fabio Vihi. Now Fabio, for those that don't know, is a professor of languages and also critical theory at the University of Cardiff. He's also a writer over on the philosophicalsalon.com, and tonight we're going to be discussing one of his recent articles where basically Fabio lays out why we are heading towards major crisis. So Fabio believes, much like I do, that the people that run this system who are kicking this debt can further and further down the road, they actually now need crisis as an excuse to print more money and to pyramid the debt even further. And that's what we're going to be getting into in tonight's show. So certainly a topic that many listeners will be familiar with. Now members, please head over to parallelmike.com to sign in to listen to the full episode. And if you're not a member yet, but you do enjoy the show, please consider joining me over on parallelmike.com to become a member and support the content further. In closing, hope you're all well, healthy and reasonably happy. And like always, I'll see you in the next one. Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. On today's show, we have a returning guest. His name is Fabio Vihi. He's a professor of Italian and critical theory at the University of Cardiff. And today, Fabio, we're welcoming you back to the show because I wanted to talk to you about some of your recent articles and particularly the disintegration of the financial system, the capitalist system, and society in general, Fabio. It's all looking pretty messy out there. But before we get into the bad stuff, how's it going?
Great to see you, Mike, first of all. It's been a while. I think it was last year that we recorded.
About a year ago, Fabio.
Probably this time, more or less, if I remember correctly. But yeah, great to see you. You look in great form and looking forward to this.
Yeah. It's been so strange, Fabio, because a year's passed and there's been a lot of things during that year and we could choose any one of them and just talk about that. But I think what you're really good at, Fabio, is giving that 10,000 foot view. You look down on it all from above and kind of weave it together in ways that I think a lot of people don't expect. And I always try and do the same stuff as well. So we've got a lot of kind of parallels in how we do this, but you've got your own unique vantage point that you come from. So maybe we could start by just talking about this revolving door of crisis. Like we said, there's so many of them. What's going on, Fabio? Why do you think that crisis is now an intrinsic part of?
Yeah. Well, there's this poly-crisis scenario, I think, that we have. This, we got a number of crises on the table that the system can use. The system is desperately in need of crisis. That's my perspective, if you like, on what's going on today, whether it's the virus crisis, whether it's a war. Incidentally, the virus crisis was also a war, right? It was considered to be a war against virus. So this kind of militarization of life really is something that the system draws upon to perpetuate itself fundamentally, right? And that's the depressing aspect of it, right? It's very depressing too. Also, why does it need crisis? Because ultimately this is a debt-based system and it needs to create money out of thin air all the time. So it needs scapegoats. It needs reasons also to sell the public for this mechanism to continue. And obviously this is more complex than that, but fundamentally the economic system that we're in is no longer working through its traditional formula, which was typical of all labor-based society, of all work-based society. Now wealth is created mostly in the financial sector, as we know, but the financial sector is debt-based, quite literally. So it needs, or credit-based, if you like. So it needs a constant wave of kind of oceans of liquidity, in fact, to stay afloat. This liquidity is, by definition, inflationary. So it debases the fiat currencies as we know them. Incidentally, that inflation is also used by the system to inflate away its own debt, right? It's an interesting mechanism. So it needs to be controlled by the system and used in favor of the system itself. So inflation has to be somehow created artificially, but also controlled, right? Because obviously, if it turns into hyperinflation, then you have a different set of issues to deal with. But inflation, in fact, is something that the system needs. Inflation needs to be higher than the debt yield, so that the debt itself can be inflated away, can be repaid more easily, essentially. But overall, to go back to that initial point, I think we are now stepping into a kind of scenario where geopolitics plays obviously a crucial role in creating crisis. We've got almost like a perfect scenario for in systemic terms, because any crisis can now be ignited, very easily. We've got the Middle East crisis, can be escalated. We've got still the Russia-Ukraine crisis that can also be escalated. So imagine, for example, if Israel were to really hit Iran, right, as they say they might do, that would immediately create an economic crisis. It would immediately project us into a kind of war scenario, which is essentially based on, which is essentially inflationary, right? All of a sudden, money will have to be created out of nowhere, because you have an oil crisis, for example, right? We have all sorts of sort of commodity crises. So paradoxically, this can be useful for the system to perpetuate itself, because that would mean lowering further the cost of money, creating more money out of thin air, safeguarding the financial sector, that is the main driver of the system, to the detriment of course, ordinary people. Right, so I think we're moving towards a control system where what is really crucial is to safeguard the financial markets and the debt market, but where the work societies are inevitably going to disintegrate, really, or fragment more and more. And there has to be a mechanism in place where that fragmentation is kept under control, some sort of manipulation of that, what I call a controlled demolition of the system, right? So the demolition will happen, I think, if we follow this logic, this economic logic. But in systemic terms, it will have to be somehow controlled to avoid scenarios that perhaps would suggest that the system itself is unable to retain its own sort of privileges and its own structures, power structures. Yeah, I think that's where we are. It's a polycrisis scenario, essentially. And I don't see a way out of it, quite frankly. I don't see a way of improving this scenario, because fundamentally what we call the work society is dying. It's dying for reasons that are intrinsic to the system. The work society is reaching its internal limit. Automation, technology are eliminating more labor than the system is able to reabsorb. That's the fundamental issue for me. At the heart of everything, at the heart of this hyper-financialized and indebted system, we have, the implosion of the labor-based world that is no longer able to create enough wealth to reproduce itself in systemic terms. And that's because of the internal logic of the system that most people, I think, struggle to grasp, right? The internal logic is an obvious one. It's a formula that has worked for a while, and that is based on the valorization of labor. So labor needs to be put to work in order to create, in capitalist terms, profits that are then somehow used to produce society. But this little formula is no longer working. And has been deteriorating now for decades, 4 or 5 decades, I would say. And I think we're now reaching the point where, the neoliberal system that sort of compensated for it is also no longer working. Maybe it could be very rapid dissolution of the system as we have it now. We could have a much larger crisis sort of starting soon, or we could have almost like a slow motion collapse of the system as it is. I think these are the two options, I'm afraid. Not very optimistic about it. I'm not very optimistic about it. I think the two options are either a sudden collapse of the system, maybe via the escalation of war, which is now, quite frankly, a realistic possibility. I think we shouldn't discount it, involving the use of, for example, tactical nuclear weapons. Or the other option is a slow death of the system via the management of fundamentally this hyper-indebted financial constellation in which we live. So I know I kind of maybe talk too much about it. Maybe there's a way of making it a bit simpler, and maybe we can talk about it a bit more. But yeah, overall, that's my sort of bird's eye view, as it were, of the situation as we're living through now.
I share the same view of it, Fabio, that essentially the system itself has evolved now or devolved to the point where the only way it can continue is to infuse it with these massive injections of money, like what happened with COVID. So that requires massive narratives, and those narratives have to be crisis narratives, because they're not going to say, oh, we're putting this money in there and we're going to devalue savings and we're going to rip off the pensioners. No, they're going to say we need to do this because of X, Y, and Z. And, you know, the sad thing for me, Fabio, is I don't even think most people have still figured out that that's what COVID was about. Most people don't know that. And I don't think most people understand any of these narratives that are happening. And there's almost been kind of a saturation of crisis with people. So it's just something that's happening. They accept it. It's not, you know, I wake up and oftentimes I feel horrified, like stuff I see on Twitter.
Yeah.
But a lot of people have lost that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, because the manipulation was successful, right? Or you can call it the brainwashing, if you like, was successful. And I think we're all, to an extent, brainwashed too. It's not as if we are completely spared of it. And at an unconscious level, maybe we want to believe that it can still work somehow. A lot of people believe that this debt, I mean, the debt is colossal, whether you think about United States or Europe or even other countries, you know, the debt is unsustainable. I mean, repayments, the sort of the rollover of the debt is becoming more and more unsustainable, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And most people think, well, a lot of people think that, you know, you can just continue creating money out of nowhere, throwing into the system, and make the central bank the creditor of last resort, as it were, and things will just perpetuate themselves endlessly. But, you know, we don't live in that, we don't live in that world. It's simply not like that. The system, first of all, is conflicted, right? There are conflicts within this global capitalist universe that now are becoming more and more real. We can talk a little bit about it. But also the debt, you know, requires, you cannot simply print money and throw it into the system, because what you get in capitalist terms is inflation, the debasement of fiat currencies, which is incidentally a phenomenon that is already happening, right? As we know very well. It's something that started at the beginning of the 20th century. You know, we are still in that phase. In the previous 2 centuries, the cost of the same basket of goods, well, in the United States, for example, was still the same. You know, 1790s up to 1913, more or less you paid the same number of dollars for the same amount of goods, right? All of a sudden, the cost of those goods has escalated, and now it's probably about to enter a new phase of further escalation. So the debt in itself is a stupid problem, but at the same time, within this system, it is a problem for the system to perpetuate itself. And there's a lot of other issues attached to it. That's why I think the West is experiencing the crisis more directly than the other countries. You know, this talk about BRICS versus the collective West, etc. I think the West, because they are more financialized, they're more dependent on the debt bubble, they would be the first to be hit. Because of the financial infrastructure, because of the dependence that we have in the West, particularly on the financial sector and its sort of debt-based mechanism, I think the West would be probably hit first by you know, economic sort of crisis. Hemingway used to say it's either, I think he wrote, a bankruptcy happens in 2 ways: first gradually, and then all of a sudden there's a collapse. So I think we are in the gradual phase now, but at some point it might turn into a very rapid collapse, you know, and then maybe at that point people will wake up, right, and think, okay, something maybe was wrong from the very start here, but we just didn't pay attention to it. It could be too late. I hope it's not too late, but it could well be too late in terms of how the system reacts to this. As I said, wars are intrinsically, paradoxically, right? Maybe they've always been, but now more than ever, good for the system, because the system can create needs for borrowed money through wars. And especially it creates conditions that allow the system to justify this recourse to borrowed money, to credit, essentially. And that's the scary thing for me, because wars today can clearly escalate into something truly spectacularly destructive, you know, thinking about nuclear wars as well. And I think it's more and more, unfortunately, a realistic option. It doesn't have to be a completely destructive nuclear war, but it could be a localized nuclear war with tactical nuclear weapons that create the perfect crisis for the system to try and reproduce this quite perverse mechanism now, right? But I think what people struggle with is to understand that capitalism per se is sort of self-destroying now, right? Because capitalism itself doesn't understand its own internal logic. It doesn't understand that it needs productive work and productive workers to reproduce itself, right? It needs to pay people to produce commodities that are then sold on the market. But because people are increasingly replaced by machines, right? They're increasingly replaced by technology. And you can't stop that because it's a competitive game. You can't stop businesses from using technologies because that gives them a vantage point in terms of gaining market shares, etc. The mechanism is inevitably implosive, and the system has to then financialize itself more and more, because in the financial sector you don't need intensive labor, right? You don't need factories where commodities are produced. You just need algorithms. Essentially, you need money creates money by itself, right? Money creates money through speculation, not through real labor. But that self-perpetuation, financial self-perpetuation of the system, first of all, it doesn't socialize communities, it doesn't socialize us. Second of all, it needs constant credit injections, as we said before, to stand up. So the system is already past its use by date. We're already past it. We just have to kind of realize it. And as you say, that awareness has not dawned on people yet, collectively. Maybe unconsciously it has, but it's not sort of moved up to the level of consciousness yet. And I think there has to be that change in people's consciousness. But insofar as people believe that this system can still get us out of trouble, it's not going to happen. I think it's going to be a painful sort of crisis-to-crisis implosion that could last many years, but could also turn, and this is very completely unpredictable, I think, could also turn into a sudden collapse, which would be catastrophic, quite frankly. Catastrophic, because all of a sudden, most people will just fight with each other for survival.
Or they could just pull it themselves. And that's what I'd do. If I was them, I'd say, listen, I don't want this falling on my family's head, metaphorically speaking. So let's engineer this and plan for it. We'll do it in a way that's going to be, from our perspective, it's going to be controlled. From their perspective, it'll be chaotic. But that chaos, so long as it doesn't turn back on us, that's what I'd be thinking.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it could also, I think it is intrinsically also an opportunity, right? Not only in abstract terms, but also in real terms. It could be an opportunity for us to sort of come up with a different idea, different sort of practice also of socialization, right? That doesn't involve the categories that are now bringing us down. So beyond those categories that are still driving this world to potentially its self-destruction. So yeah, it's unpredictable. I mean, we don't know, but at the same time, I think that you need a degree of consciousness already. You need to develop a degree of a critical consciousness that the system is, the reasons why the system is no longer working. Without a degree of consciousness, it's very difficult to move beyond it. Because one of the things that we tend to do is to try and recreate the very conditions that has brought us where we are, right? That's what you see and what you hear today when people recognize that we are in a difficult systemic situation. They tend to sort of hark back to the times when things seem to be working. And people ask, so why can't we just go back to those days and reproduce the same conditions? So yeah, politically, there's absolutely no awareness, or intentionally, there's no awareness that crisis is now systemic. There's no way of avoiding it. So all politicians can do is either promise the reproduction of these conditions, which are destructive, or nostalgically, if you like, conservatively, think that we can reproduce the old conditions, where there was this dream of full employment and endless growth. The American dream, if you like, where things could just improve. Now, this is completely naive, right? There's no way you can go back to that understanding of money, that understanding of growth. This is simply impossible. It's not going to happen. At the same time, perpetuating this system is equally tragic, because the system, as we said, can only reproduce itself through crisis. Crises which are increasingly destructive. and they can be manipulated, they can be artificial, but they can also be real. They can turn into real crises where people literally destroy each other. The military industrial sectors throughout the world, we know that they have a power now to be properly destructive, to destroy large parts of humanity. So yeah, I think awareness is the first step, even education, if you like. But I'm also fully aware that the system is trying to prevent this sort of process of understanding from happening. It has colonized education, right? If there's one thing that we don't talk about in universities, is precisely this, like trying to understand the origins of the crisis we're in. Nobody wants to talk about it. Some people have some recipes for how to be, but nobody wants to talk about how it started, how we got here, right? So nobody wants to really critique the system for what it is. That's a worry for me, because there's clearly some sort of denial, kind of collective denial at work here. People need to learn to kind of deprogram themselves a little bit. Even in everyday life, there has to be some self-distance, some critical distance from things. But it seems like we are more and more hypnotized, as you said, more and more sort of hypnotized by, even, for example, by COVID and so on and so forth. These crises have a kind of hypnotic effect on people, and we end up believing what we're told by the media, etc. So politicians and so on and so forth. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm quite pessimistic, I have to say. At the same time, I'm also aware that it's, I would say, impossible to create a perfect totalitarian system. It's impossible, because the dimension of human freedom always somehow manages to resist, if you like, that totalitarian threat. But at what price? At what cost? Right? That's the worry for the future generations, as well as the present ones, but also the future generations. At what cost will that resistance be possible?
Yeah, it might just be easier to accept your UBI, your CBDC, your tiny box flat, your computer games, and your digital girlfriend or husband, and just tune out. That would be I guess, for those that are around in that future, that's the hook, right? That you just don't get involved in any of this stuff, guys. Just live your little crappy life in your box and you'll be fine. Just don't speak up and don't step out of line.
I think that's the direction of the moment, I'm afraid. It's very sad, but I think that's how the new generations are being groomed by the system, with
Well, that's it now, Fabio. If you'll know yourself as a professor that on a university campus, free speech is a dangerous thing these days. Like, I remember when I was at university, it was already getting pretty dangerous to have an opinion that went against whatever the consensus view was. So fast forward, I don't know, 15 years, whatever it is. And yeah, I think it's definitely a part of the culture there.
It is the case, yes. As I said, it's a process of kind of colonization of the mind that it's ongoing, and it seems at the moment quite successful, but hopefully we'll be able to bounce back as well and push back a little bit against it at some point. But I'm afraid that the situation has to get much worse before we can do that, and as it gets worse, it gets very destructive, right? And also, when we're in trouble, we tend to accept conditions that are given to us. So we could accept the things that you just mentioned simply because we lost what we have. So all of a sudden we accept UBI, we accept, as you said, this kind of metaverse that could be imposed on us precisely because we're suffering. So that's why I think the crisis to crisis scenario is realistic, unfortunately, and people have to become sort of critically aware of it.
I could feel in your recent article, Fabio, that I was reading it and I was like, wow, Fabio is feeling quite pessimistic right now. And you've just admitted it. So, and here was the quote. I'm just going to share this quote.
Yeah, it's a good quote. It's a great quote. I love cinema. I love even Hollywood of the 70s. They still had something to say. Now they're totally in denial. It's absolutely ridiculous. But in the 70s, you could still, there's still some great films that really speak quite frankly about incidentally, that was the beginning of the crisis that we're still in now, right?
I think this is one of the points in history where people have misunderstood what was happening, because a lot of people today, a lot of wealthy people say, oh, well, we earn our wealth through capitalism. That's why we're rich. We just need to get the government out of the way and go back to capitalism, as though that's a panacea that would fix it by just getting rid of the government. And of course, that's so naive, because the system itself hasn't been capitalism. It hasn't been for a long time. It's creditism. And if you go back to the 1970s, when they went off of the Bretton Woods system, the only reason the system has survived over that time, which is when people thought we had capitalism, is because the US found new consumers of their debt, and the standard of living in the US was artificially high because of it. So you had, for example, the Saudi Arabians who were selling their oil for dollars. Then they would recycle all those dollars into US treasuries. So they were buying up all this debt. They became the largest holders of US debt in the world. Nobody actually knows how much they've really got. And then China did the same thing, in that the US got China to become their sweatshop, and all of those dollars they were sending across to China, the Chinese Communist Party were now buying US debt. So all these other nations became vassals for the US's debt system. But if you'd removed that, Fabio, the US would have fallen long ago.
And at the same time, China probably wouldn't be able to boom the way it did, right? Its economy without the kind of capital moving from the United States to China, because that's also what I kind of talk about a little bit in this piece, because it's a crucial passage in the 1970s where all of a sudden production was outsourced, quite literally, from the United States to China. But then the money that was created, the wealth, real wealth that was created in China, and East Asia more generally, found its way back into the US and fueled this highly consumerist system, because all the surpluses created through this outsourcing of production to China needed to be invested, as you said, treasuries into American debt, into US debt, and the US stock market. Why? Because ultimately the dollar was still the global reserve currency, and still is today, and the units of debt, the treasuries, were still the global assets to invest in, right? And I think we're still in that system, but it's pretty clear now that system is collapsing. And a lot of countries are now kind of looking at plan B, thinking, okay, so maybe we need de-dollarize. We need to move out of a system that is already insolvent. It's already practically bankrupt, and it keeps afloat precisely only through more injections of credit or debt, if you like. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it started in the 70s. In the 70s, it's also the time when automation took off, right? Third industrial revolution, digitization. People need to put these things together. For the first time in the 70s, one could argue that more labor was being eliminated and reabsorbed by the system. And I'm talking about productive labor, not bullshit jobs, because bullshit jobs can also be created. But if they're not value productive, they don't create value, right? And the state doesn't create value, rightly so. You need productive labor. Productive labor is being replaced by machines, and machines don't create value. So the whole system is ultimately relying on huge inflows of credit to stay afloat. But that is detrimental to currencies and ultimately creates this massive gap between the super rich and the rest. And this is what's destroying us already, quite literally. And this is the system that now we're trying to perpetuate. So hence my pessimism. If you like.
Well, this is why a lot of the super rich capitalists, essentially it's a modern day form of the Cantillon effect, in that they own all of these stocks, and when this QE gets put into the system, they see their Nvidia stock go up 400%, and now they can buy a new Lamborghini or a new house.
Right.
It's not working for the normal people, right? Some of them actually hold really quite abhorrent views towards the everyday person. They'll say, well, these sponges who are working as a cleaner or digging up roads. I'm like, no, those people are making the society that you live in. They're not bad people for wanting a fairer shake. So I think there's a lot of engineering to this conflict between the so-called capitalists and the everyday man and woman, who they're saying, no, they're socialists. Like we saw this with Argentina with Milei, right? He come along, and a lot of the people in the West thought he was some kind of savior because of this narrative and this characterization where, as far as I can tell, he's just another IMF debt miner. He's just going to continue to pay the debts for the IMF. That's all he is to me. And
That's right.
I think the right in America, who have more comfortable lives, unfortunately get taken in by these characterizations. So I'll just hand it back to you, Fabio, for your...
No, sorry. No, you wanted to show that little quotation. I think it's a wonderful one from the film. From the film I was quoting, Night Moves, which is a film with one of my favorite actors, Gene Hackman.
Yeah, you said one of the most frequently referenced scenes in Arthur Penn's Night Moves, 1973, features a despondent Gene Hackman slumped in front of a small black and white television, half-heartedly watching a game of American football. When his wife walks in and asks, "Who's winning?" he mutters, "Nobody. One side's just losing slower than the other." that is a pessimistic quote. And there's another quote that you said, well, I've got many quotes from this article. It's a great one. I want listeners to go away and read it. But you also said, in other words, predicaments of global concern are the only resource left to an imploding civilization whose populations increasingly resemble multitudes of zombies marching in lockstep towards their grim destiny while Instagramming every second of it.
Yeah, that's the way I feel about it. I'm afraid all this technological
I feel like I want to
addiction.
send you on holiday somewhere nice and hot, Fabio.
No, I see it sort of multiplying around me. This sort of technological addiction, especially the scrolling of the phones. It's addictive and it's hypnotic, and it prevents people from understanding the deeper causality behind what's going on. No matter what you see on the screen, because of the form of it, right? Because of the way in which it is, it has been created, you're kind of prisoner of that screen. You're not able, your mind is not able to develop deeper thoughts. It's intrinsically impossible. And the more you're addicted to it, the more sort of dependent on this very superficial kind of information culture you become. So critical thinking just evaporates. There's no possibility for it. That's. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm old-fashioned like that, but I think people need to also kind of learn to distance themselves a little bit from these devices and the information system as it is today. But yeah, the quote from the film, it really reminds me where we are today, right? Because if you go back to that deficit cycle we were talking about with US all of a sudden in the 70s with Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping allowing China to become capitalist in a way, to opening up at least to capitals, foreign capitals in 1978 with the special economic zones, etc. That created for a little while a certain balance in global terms. Producers, consumers, the system do the deficit cycle for a while sort of worked, and certainly was at the heart of that consumer boom in the 90s, especially in the West, in the United States, right? Which was based on production being outsourced to China and money flowing back into the US, through debt, as debt, as it were. So it was a debt-fueled consumerist boom, right? That of the 90s. But now that we see the two sort of, we see that kind of collaboration sort of falling apart a little. Who's winning? Who's really winning here? Are really the BRICS winning? I'm not so sure, right? I'm not so sure that the BRICS are winning anything, because essentially we share the same system, and the system is as such is no longer working. So whether you're in China, in Russia, or in another country, in a BRICS country, you're still faced with the same contradictions, with the same type of implosion, right? So if we are in a new Cold War scenario or hot war scenario, we're still sharing the same type of productive system in a way, in a quite a similar way to what was going on during the Cold War. Because even if you had an essential ideological difference between really the socialist bloc and the Western capitalist bloc, you were still sharing the same categories in terms of productivity, in terms of consumption, in terms of what money was, etc. Okay, one was state-owned, the other one was free market capitalism, but the basic categories were very, very similar. Now they're even more similar because they both share exactly the same logic. So when it comes to thinking of a way out of this impasse where we are, well, I don't think this conflict gives us a winner, even though one could argue that, in pragmatic terms, you understand why China wants to de-dollarize, for example. It's quite obvious why they're doing it in pragmatic capitalist terms, because the United States are already essentially, or the West as such really, essentially already bankrupt. So why would you invest in US treasuries, when they're losing their value? If all of a sudden the yield of the treasury spikes, the value of those treasuries just plummets. So you're holding something which is losing value. What's the point, right? From their point of view, you understand why they want to de-dollarize. Whether they have a viable plan B, I'm not so sure. Whether the next sort of Kazan summit that will take place from tomorrow, I think, will tell us something new. I doubt it. But at the same time, you understand why they want to abandon this dollar dependency. Why they want to sort of, I fully understand it. It doesn't make any sense anymore for them to hold an asset that is likely to just collapse now. More and more, it's more and more likely that it collapses. So yeah, I think that's where we are. Hence the Gene Hackman quotation.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people right now are banking on this US election, Fabio. A lot of people understand that there's something wicked happening in the world
Yeah.
and that there's these threats, but then there's also, in America especially, this is extremely powerful because, of course, they think that this guy's an outsider. Trump's going to come in with JD Vance and Silicon Valley. Elon Musk is on his team and they're going to fix it. They're going to get rid of the bad guys. They're going to turn this ship around. Do you put any weight behind that, Fabio? Do you put any credibility to it? Or do you think this is actually the system continuing itself?
Yes, I really don't. I think the two candidates are both creatures of Wall Street, to put it really simply. The election to me is more like a selection in the sense that Wall Street has already, or the big banks have already selected their candidate, and the two candidates who've been selected are already being groomed to do what Wall Street wants them to do, right? In terms of monetary policy, there's not much difference at all if you look at their monetary policy, for example.
Hey Fabio, sorry, I'm not sure what's going on today with you.
I don't know. Could it be me?
No, I think it's me.
Here.
I think it's me, Fabio. I just saw my internet cut out. So you was just saying that you think that both of their policies.
I don't see any difference. I think it's a big political spectacle. I don't think it's going to be much difference in what they do. Nothing much is going to change in financial terms. I think they're both promising more or less the same things. There would be more injections of cheaper credit into the system. We know that Trump wants to lower interest rates anyway, that he's always done that and will continue doing it. And Harris will do the same for different reasons. So ultimately, I don't think it doesn't really matter in systemic terms who wins or loses there. It's a much bigger problem than just the American political problem. It's not a political problem at that level, I don't think.
They had a debate recently and the word debt or deficit was not used by either candidate once. So I thought that was pretty telling because since 2019, the US debt, I think it's up 14 trillion since that point.
Right. It's 35 plus trillion at the moment, and a lot of it will need to be refinanced within the next couple of years, I think, and in a world that is literally, dropping, sort of selling treasuries, it's going to be difficult to refinance.
Who's going to buy that debt, Fabio?
Well, ultimately the Fed, the central bank, I think is the only buyer of last resort, but it needs reasons to do it. And of course, the whole process is massively inflationary. It's massively inflationary, which means that inflation is a tax that falls on people, on ordinary people, as we know, right? It's an extra invisible tax. So we will bear the brunt of it, or, the ordinary people will. And so the only thing that they can do is that. What's the alternative to that, and how do you bring that about? How do you bring that constant intervention of the central bank, to rescue the financial sector? We saw a perfect exemplification of it during COVID, right? For me, that was the obvious example of a central bank that needs to flood the system with freshly printed, not even printed, but simply sort of digitized cash, and that was perfect example of it. It will be more and more because that debt is getting bigger by the day. I think it's 1 trillion larger every 100 days or something now. This is insane, right? How can you think that this system is sustainable when you need to make so much debt? It's absolutely ridiculous.
I think you've got to be a conspiracy theorist to believe the system continues rather than the system ends.
Perfect. Yes. You nailed it there. It really is. That's where the conspiracy lies, right? You have to believe that there's some kind of deus ex machina, some kind of God entity that is capable of reproducing a system that is so bankrupt already. It's a simple mechanism, and yet sort of most people at least pretend not to see it, or believe that ultimately, whether you're on the left or on the right, you often believe that can just be reproduced endlessly without any consequence,
But someone's gaining here, Fabio. It can't be that the system is just chaotically swaying and swashing and going towards this catastrophic end like a train that's just going to hit a wall. Right. Like there has to be somebody that's overseeing all of this. There has to be a winner. In your article, you say who's winning. Who is winning? Someone must be winning here.
Well, if there's a winning, the winners are those, obviously, the 0.1%ers, as we know, those who actually detain power and wealth in this world. Those are able to reproduce their own conditions of possibility. But there's also an unconscious mechanism that wants all of us to believe that the system can get us out of trouble again, that capital can get us out of trouble again, without realizing that we're moving towards a neo-feudal world. It's still capitalist, I would say, but it's no longer the original formula of capitalism that is at work here. It's fundamentally, it's driven by debt. It's not driven by capitalist growth in traditional terms.
When we say it's still capitalism, it's kind of the equivalent of getting to the party at 10 o'clock and the party at 4 a.m. in the morning. It's not quite the same anymore, is it? It's the same place, same party, but it's changed.
Yes. But ultimately, still people still believe that it's about clever investment. If you listen to politicians, right, they'll tell you it's about clever investment. They don't want to look at the deficit black hole, but they tell you that if you learn to make some clever investments as a country or as an individual sort of entrepreneur, you'll be fine, and that would benefit the whole of society. So the mechanism at work working in the background is still more or less the same, even though the rules, obviously, the goalposts have moved quite a lot. But I think psychologically, we are clearly in denial. We are all in denial at different levels. We're all in denial. We still believe that this system can get us out of trouble. As I said, the only way you can do it is through more misery for most of us. And those who benefit from this system are, again, a small class of millionaires and billionaires. But even for them, life must be quite horrible at certain levels, right? First of all, what is there to gain with all this money? What do you do with all this money? Quite literally, it's an honest question. You're working all day, you will die like everybody else, and yet you're attached to a system just because of the monetary financial reward that it gives you. I don't think life can be just about that, right?
I think there has to be more to it than that as well, Fabio. I think at some point, it's kind of psychotic if that would be a driving force. And I don't think all of them are psychopaths. I think there are some, but I think a lot of them are trapped in the system just like everyone else is. But I think maybe the higher you go, the more trapped you are. Can you imagine, for example, Fabio, if I just dropped in your bank account however many billions that Bill Gates is supposed to have, would you seriously spend your time flying around the world speaking to different news agencies and promoting whatever it is? For him, it's vaccines now, but promoting any of this stuff? I even saw a video of him kind of dancing, like, he had this like tight vest on and his flabby belly, and he was dancing to this song. It was really bizarre. And I'm like, you're not choosing to do this. Somebody has reins over you to make you do this, because you wouldn't do that. Like, if you've spent your entire life accumulating, you'd say, right, now's maybe time to be with family, to actually enjoy this. And I'm sure they have luxury holidays and all of that, but they spend an awful lot of time promoting stuff. And I just think you guys seem more captured than anyone. And actually, I know since 2020, there's been a spate of billionaires dying in vicious circumstances, like all across the world. There was about 20 crypto billionaires who just died. There was recently the guy who had a big court case in the UK. I think it was near where
Sicily,
yeah.
So off the Sicilian coast, yeah.
Doesn't seem like the safest place to be either, to be a billionaire.
No, you're right. But you're right in saying that they're also caught in a mechanism, right? It's not about, like, in pre-capitalist time, you'd assume the rich people were enjoying their wealth, right? They were not just spending every minute of their life accumulating wealth. But I think because of the logic of capital, what matters to them is not how much they enjoy life, but how much capital they can accumulate. So they tend to see always what they lack. They can have billions in the bank, but they see only what they lack to get to that extra billion that would make them even richer. And it's totally perverse mechanism that ultimately I don't think they enjoy life either. As you said, they can die of heart attack when they're very young, or for whatever reasons, just because they work too much. They don't enjoy life, which isn't to say that, they're more privileged than a lot of people. Yes, they are, of course they are. But at the same time, for them, it's not about enjoyment. It's not about enjoying the wealth they have. It's about having more of it. even if it means making more debt, even if it means investing in this, that, and the other, even if it means killing more people. Ultimately, as we know now, the system depends more and more on destruction. So it's a lot of what was going on it's not clear, I don't think, to the very perpetrators. They are caught in a mechanism. They are unconsciously sort of part of this mechanism that they perpetuate, that they embody and perpetuate in many ways. So yeah, I'd agree with you. It's not about the enjoyment of your family life or your wealth, in whichever way. It's not about that. For them, it's just about, first of all, creating conditions where then nothing can change, right? They perpetuate the system. But also it's about simple accumulation of wealth. This is what matters. This is the joy. This is the kicks they get. Having more, having more, having more. That's why you have all these, sort of, who's the top billionaire in the world, and then, I'm number 3, maybe I can go up to number 2. I mean, there's all, it literally is insane. But that's what capital does. Capital is defined precisely as money seeking self-expansion. The purpose, the drive, the aim is self-expansion of money. Nothing else. It's not about the enjoyment of money. Money is not just a universal equivalent that you can use to buy commodities and enjoy them because it's nice to spend 3 weeks eating well or with your family or in a nice villa or whatever. No, that's not the real aim. The real aim is to accumulate more. So expanding what you already have in monetary terms. This is what capital is. And we're still built on that formula, irrespective of whether you need labor to do that, you need to exploit labor, or you need a financial system that works for you.
Yeah, these people, I think they are out of the mind, actually. I'm going to renege on what I said. Changed my mind.
Yeah.
But they are insane, because I can't imagine getting enjoyment that way or getting my kicks with numbers on a screen. Right. To be honest, Fabio, I do get excited when I have more eggs and more chickens. That does.
Well, exactly. Come on,
feel happy.
This is, yeah. I think we should go back to enjoying the simple things as well. I mean, it's so obvious. It's I feel almost like ashamed saying it, but it's such an obvious thing.
Since I first ever bought any gold, for all of the reasons we're talking about, seeing this future ahead of us and thinking, well, I need to protect whatever I save. Like, I can't save it in the bank. So
yeah,
we bought our first ounce of gold. And I remember for me and my wife at the time, it was a lot of money. We both sat there. I think we discussed it for about 2 weeks for buying a 1 ounce gold coin. And anyway, we ended up buying it, and we sat there thinking, "Oh, did we do the right thing?" And fast forward a decade, I'd say, and that 1 ounce gold coin, which we paid, I think we paid about £900 for it, Fabio, and now it would cost around £2,050. And that is very instructive as to just how bad it's getting. Like, that shouldn't be happening, right? Because
so exactly, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing two phenomena which are quite obviously incredibly contradictory, right? When you correlate them, you've got financial markets breaking new highs all the time, right? So if you look at the Standard & Poor 500, they're going up. More and more money is going into it, clearly. At the same time, you've got gold breaking historical records. So how do you explain that? Gold is as you said, it's kind of defensive investment, right? It's about protecting what you have and making it easier. Whereas on the other hand, you have risk, sometimes extreme risk. So money is going into both financial sector and it's going into gold and precious metals, particularly gold. So clearly, to me, that reflects a kind of schizophrenic mind frame where people understand that there's something wrong, so they invest in gold. At the same time, though, they trust the system to inflate their stocks, which is speculative, often derivatives, and so on and so forth. Isn't that where we are? Probably that's where we are. People are undecided and a bit confused. Keep in mind that most of gold investments is in the BRICS countries, right? China, India, and so on. Still, a very small percentage of Western investments goes into gold compared to even the 1980s. Crazy, right?
I think it's less than 1% of pension funds have any gold in it.
I think the average is of all investments in the West is 0.5%. So very, very little, which also tells you that the price of gold will probably go much higher as soon as people realize that they need to invest more in gold.
How do you feel about, Fabio, that they're trying to kind of now pivot towards these digital assets?
Well, yes, that's the other. We haven't touched on it, but I mean, to me, again, that's an obvious outcome of this system, right? I mean, the attempt to digitalize it, to eliminate physical cash, which already is fiat, right? Already is based. It's purely something that it has no intrinsic value. It's simply the system that tells you that it has value when you believe it, right? So it's not real already, but when you get rid of physical, then you have the chance to control people's lives almost completely, because you tie it to, as we know, central bank digital currencies. So I agree with you. I'm conspiratorial as well on cryptos and crypto space. It's not by accident that both Trump and Harris are pushing the crypto space, right? They're saying, oh, yes, crypto's crypto. So they know that that's where the system is going. And I think that maybe the next big crisis, when there is one in economic financial terms, that would be the time to try and bring in this digital infrastructure that replaces the current one. Maybe slowly, maybe partially, but it will be done, I think, at some point. Because, as you know, they're not all stupid. As you said, they're not all stupid. They're not all psychos. They know very well that the system is dying. Central bankers, they've been piloting CBDCs for quite a long time now. So they know that at some point they will need to bring them in. And that's a system of total control. That's we're talking about a totalitarian system in real terms. That's where you end up when you have CBDCs, right? And again, what will happen at that point? Will people stay asleep? Will they wake up? Will they resist? Will they, we don't know. But I think that's also going to happen. That's part of where we're going, I think, I'm afraid.
Okay, everyone, that's it for part number 1. I hope you enjoyed this fascinating conversation with Mr. Fabio Vihi. A big thank you to Fabio for joining me once again on the show. But of course, for members, we've got a lot more to go in part number 2, where me and Fabio pick right up where we left off. So if you are a member, please make sure you signed in at parallelmic.com. And if you're not a member, please consider coming over there and signing up to listen to the full episode, not just of me and Fabio, but also we've got many other great episodes on there. We've got the Saturn's Bankers series, which is ongoing, many deep dive episodes that I've done in the past, and some fantastic interviews. So there's a lot of value in that subscription, but of course it helps support me and the content also, and is a vote for free speech and independent content creators. In closing, I hope you're all well, healthy, and reasonably happy. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.
What you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
is within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you, the people, have the power.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Honestly expressing yourself.
our time, peace in all time.